It's Friday, June 27, 2025. Welcome to Make It Make Sense. I'm Grant Herms. Earlier this week, a friend of mine asked why the U.S. was so enamored, so intertwined with Israeli politics, why we would feel the need to step in on Israel's behalf in this now called 12-day war between Israel and Iran. And it was one of those things that as somebody who reads a lot of politics, who follows politics day in, day out, you sort of take it for granted that, of course, the U.S. is always going to side with Israel. And so to explain, I think of this thing in three categories. And the first one is that the U.S. needs a strong partner in the Middle East, and Israel has been our strongest. It's a part of an idea of global security and securing our national interests in other parts of the world. And that's been the case for pragmatists and practical thinkers in politics on both sides of the aisle for decades now. The other category is there's a lot of money here. And I know that sounds like I'm slipping into some sort of conspiracy theory, but that's not what I mean. There are really powerful lobbying groups who have spent a lot of money to make sure that the U.S. and Israel have a strong relationship. It's not just politics, it's also groups that charter vacation trips to Tel Aviv or to Jerusalem that partner with schools or churches. But when you talk about these groups, there are really just two of them that stand out most often. AIPAC, AIPAC, which is the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, and another group called J Street. Now, AIPAC has given hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more than $1 billion, to Republican candidates over the years, and they tend to be more conservative. On the other side is J Street. They tend to be more liberal and have given quite a bit less money, but are still influential. And I should say here that these two organizations will cross the aisle depending on the candidate or the race. But then there's this last category that has something way more mystical about it, more spiritual. It comes from certain ideas of Christian nationalism, things called Christian dominion or Christian Zionism, which you'll hear today with our guest, Matt Taylor, because Matt was the first guy I thought of when thinking about the influence of Christian nationalism and why the U.S. would want to get involved in the fighting between Israel and Iran in the way that we did, because there are an awful lot of people around the president right now who believe in these certain ideas. Matt was kind enough to come on the show twice this week, actually. We had a snafu with some tech issues, and so I talked to him yesterday, and then we had to re-record our conversation this morning. He is the senior scholar at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies and is also an associate fellow at the Center for Peace Diplomacy in New Orleans. And as I was thinking about this idea of Christian nationalism and this bombing airstrike that we launched on Iran, he also was thinking about it. And so I'm happy to welcome Matt Taylor back on the show. But before we get to that, please rate and review the show. Make sure you're following and subscribed on whatever app you listen to, or if you're watching it on YouTube, sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack. It's just $5 a month. And share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant Herms TV on every other social media app. You can tag me there too. All right, let's get to our interview with Matt Taylor. Hey, listener. You know what the show is all about breaking down the news in a way that actually makes sense. No spin, just real reporting and smart conversations. And as an audience, you're sharp, curious, and engaged. And I know that you value where you spend your time and money. So if you're a brand, an organization, or a cause that aligns with truth, trust, and just cutting through the noise, then we want to partner with you. Whether you're launching a new product, pushing a policy, or you just want to get your message in front of an audience that values insight over outrage, let's make it make sense together. For ad rates, sponsorship packages, and custom campaigns, you can email ads@matchbookmediapod.com. That's ads@matchbookmediapod.com. Because the smartest conversations deserve the smartest partners. Okay, let's get on with the show. So, Matt, thank you again for coming back because after our tech issues yesterday, listeners, I just talked to Matt about this yesterday, and then we had tech problems, and so we have to redo it today. So I think this conversation will be just as good. But Matt, thank you again for coming back on the show and doing it twice in 2 days.
Always a pleasure, Grant. Here.
So let's start here with how we understand America's involvement and an understanding of American Israel politics, specifically from this third section that is, I think you call it dispensationalism, but it's an idea that, like, if we're going to get involved in Israel politics, it's about bringing the rapture about. Is that right?
Yeah, if we go back in American history, there was a lot of optimism in evangelical Protestantism in the 19th century, the sense that they could build the kingdom of God on earth. This is formally what we call post-millennialism. And then the Civil War happens, and you have Christians on both sides, these optimistic Christians who think they're building the kingdom of God, slaughtering each other in the Civil War. And one of the great historians of American evangelicalism, Mark Knoll, has a book, The Theological Crisis of the Civil War, right? And all these folks, the Civil War was in many respects a holy war between two forms of American Christian nationalism, both thinking that they are doing the work of God. And this precipitates a real crisis of faith. And the disillusion of this optimism, this eschatological optimism that they can affect God's kingdom. And this is where you get the spread of dispensationalism. In the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, it starts with a guy named John Nelson Darby. And the basic idea of dispensationalism is that you can divide up human history from a biblical perspective, right? Like the biblical story of human history into eras, into different segments that they call dispensations. And so there's Adam and Eve had a dispensation of creation, and then there's a dispensation of law under Moses, and then a dispensation of grace under Christ. And the long-term effect, though, of dispensationalism, if you go and if you really want to have some fun, I know you've gotten to do this a little bit, Grant. You can just Google dispensational chart, and you'll find these fascinating charts. I mean, dispensationalists, they love to diagram everything out and try to draw the whole story of the biblical story on one single page. And but the big realization that they have theologically is they come to the conclusion that the real story of the Bible is the story of Israel, and that Christianity itself is just a sort of parenthesis in this bigger story of Israel. And so beginning in that kind of post-Civil War era, the late 19th century, you start to see this fixation, this fascination with Israel, and especially with this concept of the rapture, this particular reading of the Bible that says there needs to be a state, a Jewish state in the historic land of Israel in order for Jesus to return, in order for the rapture to happen, in order for the eschaton, right, the last things in Christian theology to happen. This is a crucial building block, and this begins this big push of Christian Zionism in the late 19th century that carries all the way through the founding of Israel, all the way through the end of the 20th century, and was kind of the dominant shaping force of Christian Zionism.
Yeah, you said sort of a buzzword here, and can you break down for me really quick what Zionism is in the first place, and then let's talk about Christian Zionism, because I think people a lot of times will see Zionism, they'll see people online being accused of being Zionists, which obviously that's not always fair or correct. And so what is Zionism just as a principle? I think it's important for listeners to understand that.
Yeah, Zionism is the idea that Jews should have a nation state. It gets started in Europe at the end of the 19th century, right? So if you think about, right, in the U.S., you've got this spread of dispensationalism, this growth of Christian Zionism, which we can talk about in a minute. But in Europe, you had a really rising tide of anti-Semitism, especially in Eastern Europe or the kind of Russian Empire domains. And there's pogroms against Jews. And this, I mean, the term anti-Semitism is coined right around the same time that the term Zionism is coined, right? Because they're both reacting to this rising tide of hatred towards Jews in Europe. And there's this sense among Jews, they're looking around. I mean, this is the era of nationalisms, right? Where all these different forms of nationalism are emerging, blood and soil nationalisms in Europe. And Jews are the minority population in many of these communities and countries. And they're looking around and saying, why don't we have a nation? Why don't we have a nation state that protects us and is consonant with our ethnic identity in the way that these other kind of folks around Europe are making these claims? And so this begins this movement towards, among Jewish communities, towards a Jewish state. And even early on in Zionism, these Zionist circles in Europe, there's debates about where that state would be. At one point, they were looking at modern day Uganda as a potential location for a Jewish state. And there was a real movement and argument about whether that would be a feasible possibility. But then over time, the focus narrows more and more towards the Eastern Mediterranean, the biblical lands of Israel. And this becomes then this building impulse within Jewish communities that then after the Holocaust, after World War II, with the formation of the United Nations, you finally have this realization of this thing that had been building for over 50 years by that point.
Right. And so then Christian Zionism is something adjacent to this. And I think yesterday when we talked, you had said that in this way, there's an element in Christian Zionism that the Jewish people are means to an end for a thing. And that's how they understand Israel. And that obviously we're building to how modern Christian Zionism works and how that it's impacting our current White House. But am I too far off base about what, Christian Zionism is?
Yeah, I would define Christian Zionism as Christian support for the state of Israel for theological reasons. So you could be a Zionist and a Christian, but not be a Christian Zionist, right? I would characterize Joe Biden that way, right? Joe Biden is a Zionist. That is his orientation. He thinks that Jews should have a state and that we should protect the state of Israel, but he's Catholic, right? And Christian Zionism that we talk about is really more or less a Protestant phenomenon, at least in the mainstream of it. And so I mean, I think for political reasons, Joe Biden, and probably for social reasons, I'm sure he has many Jewish friends. He has kind of attachments from having visited Israel, working with different prime ministers there, right? But he's a Zionist. It's not theological for him, right? It's pragmatic, it's political, it's American, right? But it's not a theological thing for him. Christian Zionism is this movement that emerges, and there's different strands of it, different variations of it. The really dominant one that emerges at the end of the 19th century is this dispensational one that wants to say we need to have a nation, a restored nation of Israel, to fulfill biblical prophecy in order to set up the second coming of Jesus.
Right. In this Rube Goldberg timeline we've set up, if it doesn't trigger this thing here, we don't get the end of this thing.
Right. And they very much see this instrumentally. And yeah. So there's a bargain that's forged between these Jewish Zionist organizations and groups and leaders, most of whom are actually in Europe. Within the Jewish community in the US, at least in the early 20th century, there's not as much of a surge of this Zionism, because the dominant form of Judaism in the US is Reform Judaism at the time. And Reform Jews are much more interested in integrating into American culture rather than trying to form a different nation state that they can belong to. And so in the US, it's really the Christian Zionists who become the major movers, the major actors, but they're sometimes working with some of these Jewish Zionist groups. But the bargain is, from the Jewish perspective, these dispensationalists might be kind of wacky. They might have these crazy ideas. They might believe that they're going to get taken away by Jesus at any moment. They might think we're all going to convert in the end when Jesus comes back. But they're wrong, and they're supporting us, and they are our allies. And for Jewish communities in Europe who are being persecuted, who are being attacked, they didn't have a lot of allies at that moment, right? And so these evangelical folks feel like, hey, at least they're supporting us and advocating for us, right? And then on the evangelical side, they're like, Jews are God's people and we need to protect them and care for them, but also they can become this linchpin, this hinge for the eschaton, for bringing about the end of the world. And that's really important to these dispensationalist folks. And so they're both instrumentally using this relationship, but that's kind of the bargain. And that bargain is forged long before the formation of the state of Israel in 1948. Those things are going on in the early 20th century. And then once the state of Israel is formed, these kind of regiments of Christian Zionists become ardent supporters of the state of Israel. And you have all these Christian Zionist organizations that are driving tourism to Israel, that are connecting churches to Israel, are funding charitable giving and human aid projects within Israel. And so there really is a whole ecosystem that has emerged of this interface between the Christian Zionist infrastructure and then the Israeli government and Israeli civil society that's very robust today. And there's a lot of deep connections there.
It seems to me too that it's changed over the course of when these ideas started, and this sort of bargain that was struck initially between Christian Zionists and Jewish people just looking for a home in which they weren't going to be, put through pogroms, right? That seems to have changed into what we understand now. It looks like a different thing, and I think that does get us to the week of coverage about the Iranian strikes, because. And as you wrote, like, it is dispensationalism, but it's actually something a step further. So will you break that down for me?
Yeah, so dispensationalism in the 20th century really is the dominant force in Christian Zionism. And it goes through kind of waves, and there's a big wave after the Six-Day War in 1967, right? Israel has this kind of really quite remarkable victory over the surrounding Arab enemies, and many Christians begin comparing this to biblical accounts of Israel's triumphs over its ancient foes and saying, see, this is a fulfillment of prophecy. This is a sign of Israel's alignment with God and God's protection over this nation. And so you get a surge of this. There's a very famous book written in the early 1970s called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey, one of the best-selling nonfiction books of the 20th century in America. And it's this kind of lighthearted romp through the eschaton and Armageddon, kind of speculating about, hey, maybe this image in the Bible is referring to Russia. Maybe this image in the Bible is referring to Turkey, right? And just kind of imagining the book of Revelation playing out in the end of the 20th century, centrally featuring the United States, right? And so this is the dispensational kind of moment, the Left Behind series, right? All these kind of dispensational informed visions of the end of the world. But what has been shifting more recently, and this begins really starting around the 1980s, is this changeover into a more charismatic mode of Christian Zionism. And what I mean by charismatic here is we're talking about Christians who are oriented towards supernaturalism. So charismaticism, or the charismatic movements, Pentecostalism is a charismatic movement, right? The charismatic Christians believe in the gifts of the Spirit. These are described in the New Testament, things like speaking in tongues, things like healing, things like prophecy. So they believe in these kind of supernatural dimensions of Christianity, and you're trying to access those again. And so what we've had is this kind of changeover. So you get all these kind of institutions and things and kind of relationships established by the dispensationalists, but then over time, many of those institutions have been taken over, or new institutions have been founded by charismatic preachers who are not dispensational by and large, and who are not waiting for the rapture. In fact, these charismatic styles of Christian Zionists are much more kind of eclectic in their theology, much more dramatic in their politics, and even have more of an accelerationist impulse. So they are not necessarily buying into this whole kind of dispensational program and Christians are waiting for the rapture, because in their view, dispensationalism is much too pessimistic. They're more like those evangelicals of the 19th century that say, we can build the kingdom of God on earth. That is our mission. That is our task. They're also heavily informed by what we would call the prosperity gospel, right? This idea that God wants to prosper God's people. And they say, look, in Genesis chapter 12, we're told that anyone who blesses the family of Abraham gets blessed, and anyone who curses the family of Abraham gets cursed. We need to bless Israel. We need to support Israel. We need to back Israel, because that's how we will get blessed, right? This is very, very different than dispensationalism, like trying to set up the dominoes for Jesus to come back, right? This is more of a dominion style, and it's heavily informed by something called dominion theology, this idea that Christians are supposed to rule over the earth. This kind of dominion style, we control the program, and we are going to build God's kingdom. We're going to take over societies, and Israel becomes still instrumental, right? Still a part of this bigger Christian program, but becomes much more of an agenda unto itself.
Sure.
In the sense that we want to back Israel.
I want to ask one, but before you keep going, I want to ask one thing, because there is a principle when you talk about far right movements in general, that is accelerationism. You hear it a lot among white supremacists, white nationalists. They want to accelerate what they think is a coming race war or civil war, specifically in the United States, but that's obviously broadened out into the West in general. Is that the same idea in this? Do these charismatic accelerationists in this, are they looking for a way to kickstart Armageddon or World War III, that in the idea that they would get behind something like the U.S. getting involved in this fight between Israel and Iran? Obviously, we can in a minute talk about the story of Esther and Mordecai too, because that's in here. But is that part of this? Is it the same thing in the like? I'm going to use your metaphor, in the domino effect that is dispensationalism. Are these folks trying to skip ahead halfway into that series of dominoes and poke it from there instead of at the beginning?
Yeah, it's kind of complicated. So they actually would not agree with the same timeline and outline that the dispensationalists have. So they are not anticipating a rapture, right? They're not expecting that Christians just get pulled out of the earth at some point. They see that as kind of cowardly, actually. They're like, no, we want to fight. We want to take the earth. So they're much more militant in that sense than the dispensationalists were. And they have their whole program is informed by modern prophecy. So the dispensationalists, right, their whole program is informed by biblical prophecy. And many Christians believe in biblical prophecy, that there are passages that that allude to future events in the Bible that have not yet happened, right? And many, I would say maybe even the majority of Christians throughout history have believed in biblical prophecy. These folks believe in modern prophecy, that there are prophets who walk among them, who hear directly from God and can speak the words of God to individuals, to communities, and to nations. And more like the model of like the Hebrew Bible prophets, right? And so they have all these other messages incoming that they believe are from God. And they also are heavily steeped in this conception of spiritual warfare. And so in spiritual warfare, right, is this idea that there are angels and demons in this invisible spiritual realm who are battling all around us. And many Christians believe in spiritual warfare. But the charismatic folks make spiritual warfare into a global program. And some of these folks, especially like the New Apostolic Reformation that I study, they would say that there are demons that control territory. And so you heard some of these NAR leaders, even this last week, saying the Prince of Persia is the demonic principality that controls Iran. And so we are praying against that principality, but also through these airstrikes, God is hitting and taking down the power of the Prince of Persia, so that then Christian conversions can happen in Iran, right? That's a whole other program than dispensationalism, right?
These airstrikes aren't just the use of Patriot missiles and bunker buster bombs, but they're smitings. And how they understand this?
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah. They see that this war itself represents God taking dominion over Iran, and their prayers, right? So this is where there's kind of this aura of spiritual violence around the whole thing. Their prayers are directed at that principality, that demon, and they would say, "Oh well, we love the people of Iran. We want them to come become Christians, right?" But that principality, that demon over Iran, needs to be diminished, needs to have its power taken down. And what Israel and the US are doing is part of this spiritual conquest of Iran, right? And they would say, well, and we've got these prophecies about the Prince of Persia, and we can align a couple like Bible passages around that, but we can see that this is what is supposed to happen. And then sometimes that's where they'll draw in references to the book of Esther that also takes place in ancient Persia, right? And this becomes then this kind of chaotic assemblage of theological ideas and prophecies that, I mean, it sells well. I listen to that sermon, right? I'm interested in those ideas. How'd you get there, right? But when that gets injected into foreign policy, and suddenly you have advisors around Trump who are thinking these thoughts and sharing these messages, and Trump is trying to react to and interact with his Christian advisors and the proxies of millions of Christians that of his most ardent supporters that they represent, right? This gets really dicey pretty quick.
Right. And I think among those advisors is Pete Hegseth, who the Secretary of Defense, who is not part of NAR, but he's a part of a different sect, right? It's Reconstructionalist. Is that what it is?
Yeah, so they're called the Reformed or Calvinist Reconstructionists in the plural. This is a separate theological movement. Interestingly, it's also a form of dominion theology. So actually, dominion theology gets started in these Calvinist circles and kind of migrates over into the charismatic circles. So these are also kind of dominion folks, but the group that Hegseth is tied in with, these Reconstructionist types, I mean, they also have a program of Christian supremacy, of taking over societies. They're much, much more gradualist in their approach. And so they think in the order of generations. They think in the order of kind of reforming societies over the long span of time. They think of themselves as very heady and cerebral and intellectual, and they like big words. They are usually white male influencers with big beards who are pastors, and so they really care about. They're kind of like the dispensationalists. They want everything to fit together, except they're not doing it through dispensationalism. They're doing it through this very formal Calvinism, right? But these kind of Reconstructionist types, they're the ones who are founding all these classical Christian academies, and they're the ones who are really driving a lot of the homeschooling movement, right? They want to inculcate generations with their ideas and spread their ideas and their influence and build their programs in these enclaves. And there's a big one in Moscow, Idaho, around a guy named Doug Wilson. They're trying to build a new enclaves around Nashville, right? So they're trying to kind of craft these microcosms of theocracy, more or less, that they would see as a model for a new society. But that's the world of Pete Hegseth, right? That now, interestingly, these Reconstructionist folks, they are not that pro-Israel, at least not theologically. Israel doesn't really play a role in their theological program. But Pete Hegseth grew up Baptist and has very profoundly espoused forms of Christian Zionism, Christian supremacy. He's kind of got this fixation with the Crusades, and not in like I'm a student of history and I'm really curious about the intricacies of Muslim Christian relations in the 11th century kind of fixation. He thinks of himself as a modern crusader.
Yeah. His book is called American Crusade. He's got a tattoo of the Crusaders' cross on his chest. He's got the Crusaders' motto on his arm, which is Deus Vult, which is God wills it.
Yes.
Which is informing of how he approaches the military. But yeah, he's one of these people.
Yeah, and more recently he even got a new tattoo, kind of unclear where, but it just started showing up in photos. He likes to be photographed with his shirt off. And he's got it's the word kafir in Arabic.
Yeah.
And kafir, I mean, literally would translate as unbeliever, but the kind of conventionally gets translated in English as infidel, right? It's at least according to jihadi Salafi kind of groups, would be the people who are legitimate for Muslims to attack, right? In this one formulation of Islam. So like that is profoundly Islamophobic. It's at the very least, right? To put that word on yourself and label yourself that is to say I'm an enemy of Muslims and come at me, right? Like it's a and this is our Secretary of Defense who is helping to conduct foreign policy in the Middle East, right? And he, I mean, and Hegseth, a few years back, I think it was 2018 or 2019, during the first Trump administration, while he was still a Fox News host, was in Jerusalem at the King David Hotel talking to some Jewish groups there, and there's video of this online. He's just kind of openly speculating about the demolition of the Dome of the Rock and building a third temple. So right, the history is right in the middle of Jerusalem is Mount Zion. That was where the original temple, Solomon's temple, was built. That's where the second temple was built that was destroyed by the Romans in the 1st century. Right now on that site is the Dome of the Rock and the Haram al-Sharif, the third most sacred site in all of Islam. To build a third temple would require removal of the third holiest site in Islam by Christians or Jews, unclear. And how can you conceptualize what that would do interreligiously and globally? I mean, putting like stabbing the back of 2 billion Muslims does not seem like a good either defense or peace policy, right? But and here he's theologically speculating about these things. I don't know where he stands currently. His like it as much as he's in the Reconstructionist camp, he might lean more towards some of these more anti-Semitic approaches on the far right, because a lot of the people around Hegseth have gone profoundly anti-Semitic and even neo-Nazi friendly more recently. But then he also has this kind of legacy philo-Semitic Christian Zionist piece. And this is the thing, is when we talk about Christian Zionism, not all the time, but often, that is just a form of Christian supremacy with this little temporary carve out for Israel. Right? It's really a Christian program. It's really about Christians taking over, Christians having power. And there's this more dispensationalist, kind of gradualist, like we're just going to protect Israel version. And then there's this more accelerationist, right? We want to bring about the end of the world. And that's what accelerationism is, right? Is the current order is defunct and faulty and needs to be toppled. And we're going to try to instigate actions that will accelerate the timeline of the impending collapse, so that the new thing can be built out of the ashes. That's what accelerationism is.
Is the sort of like, insert handshake emoji thing here between anti-Semitism and philo-Semitism, people who love Israel and Jewish people, is it Christian dominion, this idea that it is the duty, I guess, holy prophecy that Christians should rule over not just the U.S. or the Middle East or whatever, but the entire world? Is that where these two meet?
Yeah, I mean, so let me define some terms. So anti-Semitism, right? And I'm defining this very, very broadly, is the idea that Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore they need to be hated. Philo-Semitism, right? What many people would think of as the opposite of anti-Semitism, the love of Jews, very, very frequently takes the form of Jews are different than the rest of humanity, and therefore we need to love them. Right? Jews are God's chosen people. Jews have, and you'll find these sentiments among Philo-Semites sometimes. Jews have special abilities. They're cunning. They're good with money, right? Like it's all the tropes of anti-Semitism start to surface in these Philo-Semites, right? Because again, the beginning step is the dehumanization. They're different than the rest of humanity, And therefore, right? And then it's just a difference of mood, right? And so you can have dominion theology people like the Reconstructionists who are believe in Christian dominion and are anti-Semitic. By many of them are overtly anti-Semitic right now. And then you can have this dominion theology style with the charismatics, where they're overtly philo-Semitic and talking about how they love the Jews and bless Israel. But the bigger program is dominion. The bigger program is Christian power and the fulfillment of their vision of Christianity, the instantiation of their vision of Christianity. And so I would argue that even though, like, in their presentation, they're very, very different. And I think you saw this even in the argument between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz, right? Ted Cruz was doing this kind of philo-Semitism. I mean, Ted Cruz, his father is a charismatic preacher. He grew up with this stuff, right? And so he's doing the Genesis 12, I bless Israel, that's why I support Israel thing. And Tucker Carlson, who has flirted with, dipped his toes into, platformed all kinds of forms of anti-Semitism, was kind of standing in for this more kind of far-right anti-Semitic vision. But on some level, it's all Christians talking to each other about what they should do with the Jews, right? And this is where it gets very deeply concerning to me, is there are all kinds of forms of Christian Zionism and philo-Semitism that are not good for Jews, at least I think objectively, right? They're I mean, Christians throughout history have cycled through these different phases of loving Jews and hating Jews, loving Jews for theological reasons, hating Jews for theological reasons, but often they're never dealing with or interacting with real world Jews and hearing from Jewish voices what Jewish needs and concerns are. And the legacy of Christianity and Judaism is a very, very dark legacy and very, very harmful history. And I worry that this can be another cycle of that, because philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism are really just two sides of the same coin if you're making this dehumanizing move at the start. And I worry as well that the Zionist side of the bargain, right? The folks who got in bed originally with the dispensationalists, I don't know if they are aware of who they're in bed with now, fully. And as a Christian, right, I'm looking at the Christians that they're hanging out with, and I'm saying, I think you should do a closer examination of who your partners are, because the tectonic shifts of evangelical theology are happening underneath your feet, and you might not be aware of it. But those Christians that are now most vocal in their support for the state of Israel and saying we need to unequivocally support the state of Israel tend to be more of this accelerationist variety. And we saw this. I mean, we saw Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, sends a text message or Truth Social message. I'm not totally clear exactly how it worked, but he sends this message to Trump saying, "Hey, not since Harry Truman has somebody had an opportunity like you have here, but also you will hear from God." I don't want my president hearing from God. I'm a Christian. Donald Trump claims to be a Christian. I don't want my president hearing from God. I want him acting in the best interests with sobriety and consideration of the U.S. people and of the world, and not hearing from God, right? Like through who? Through his advisors, through the voices in his head, right? I don't trust those voices to accurately convey the will of God to the president. I want him to act like a president. And part of the problem is you've got these theological people who are very, very invested in certain narratives and visions, and who want to kind of drive those things, and they really believe them, but they're in positions of great influence and great power and seem to be having some impact on policymaking and decision making.
That's my next question here is, over the last few months, the lens that you look at these things through is so specific. So what has it been like for you to watch not just the Iranian airstrikes last weekend, but the overall tone and direction that this second Trump administration is heading in because, well, yes, he was surrounded by a lot of charismatic Christian Dominion, Christian Zionist leaders in his first term. It feels like there are fewer guardrails for those same people this time around, just like they are in other areas. So are you seeing that too, or how have you been trying to circle these squares?
Yet Trump's appeals to hardline far-right Christians have become much, much more overt. I mean, they became more overt in the 2024 campaign. They became much more overt after the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania. And Trump's rhetoric has really changed. People close to him say that he has changed since that. But he's much more frequently invoking God, invoking this idea that God spared him, that God providentially protected him for this purpose of making America great again, of saving the United States, of protecting Israel. So there's this, right? He's tapping into all these narratives that are already there. I mean, there have been hundreds of these charismatic prophecies about Trump. That was, in many ways, one of the theological forces that drove January 6th, were Christians who believed the prophecies about Trump and could not accept that he had lost the 2020 election. Well, those prophecies are all still percolating and populating and filling charismatic media. And so there's all this ferment around Trump, this messianic ferment around Trump in many of these Christian circles. And I'm watching these advisory circles, the religious advisory circles around Trump, and in the first term, pretty early on in the first term, Trump did something that many U.S. presidents had promised the state of Israel, but none had ever done, and that was to move the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv, the kind of officially globally recognized capital of Israel, to Jerusalem, the conservative Christian recognized capital, the contested city of Jerusalem, and laying claim to that, right? No president had done that until Trump. And he did it largely at the behest of his evangelical advisors. In fact, he castigated the Jewish community in the United States afterwards and said, I don't understand. The evangelicals are grateful that I did this. Why aren't you grateful? Well, the Jewish community, which is only 2% of the US population, was deeply divided on this question. There were surveys done. They didn't know whether this was a good idea. It was the Christian Zionists that were driving that policymaking. And then Trump kind of flips the coin, right? From philo-Semitism to anti-Semitism against the Jewish community here, right? And now I'm watching again as Trump is taking a step that many US presidents have contemplated, but none have pulled the trigger on, right? That's the definition of accelerationism, right? You're going beyond the kind of past patterns, a bombing Iran, right? And potentially, I mean, kicking a hornet's nest, potentially triggering the acceleration of their nuclear program if it's still intact. Unclear, right? And really kind of making this bold and aggressive move on behalf of Israel. But who gets left out of that? I mean, the Christians are all rah-rah. The Christian Zionists are all rah-rah. But there's also this surge that we're seeing of anti-Semitism in the country that is targeting that 2% of the population that's Jewish, who does not have that relative amount of power and protection, right? And so it really does concern me that I mean, once you're introducing modern prophecy and modern prophets and demons over countries into foreign policy considerations, and those are the voices around the president, the potential for massive miscalculation, for not listening to intelligence, for not making the best decision given the historical circumstances and the different considerations globally, is really high. And that this is this bigger worry, right? We've got people around Trump who are genuine religious extremists, who have wild agendas and ideas, and who Trump is attentive to, not necessarily because he believes them, but because he cares about the people who listen to them.
Well, Matt, thank you again for coming on again today, twice in 2 days. I'm still sort of stuck on the fact that we have to spend our lives thinking about the tattoos that Pete Hegseth has on his body. That's a thing that we have to stop and pay attention to now.
The thing is, if these people were obscure, I would be very happy to ignore them.
Yeah.
But they are in positions of great prominence and great influence, and they are shaping world affairs. And so we need to understand what they believe and where they're coming from, because that is informing the way that they do their jobs.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, Matt. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I want to thank Matt again for coming on the show multiple times this week. You can find links to the great work he's doing at the Institute for Islamic, Christian, and Jewish Studies, as well as the Center for Peace Diplomacy, and his book that came out last year called The Violent Take It by Force. I have found it to be almost required reading to understand our current moment in politics. But otherwise, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. Like, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos if you're watching there. As always, sign up for the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got new articles and live videos going up all the time. It's just $5 a month. And as always, share the show on social media. It's Mims Newspod. That's MIMS Newspod. All one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on Twitter and Blue Sky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you next week.